Today, we're at Cheaha State Park and headed up to the highest point in Alabama. Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we are in the Deep South and headed up to the top of the Yellowhammer State. But before we start this adventure, take a moment to click that red subscribe button and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located in Cleburne County in the eastern part of the state, Cheaha Mountain is found in the Talladega Mountains, the southernmost part of the Appalachian chain that dominates the eastern United States. These wooded mountains are the surviving remnants of an ancient range. This area is the northern Piedmont upland physiographic region of Alabama and is composed of a combination of metamorphic and igneous rocks. These rocks are some of the oldest in the state, dating back to the Precambrian era, over 600 million years ago. They are incredibly erosion resistant and are a major factor in why these mountains appear as tall as they do. It's hard to imagine today, but at one point the mountains here would have rivaled what you see in the Andes or the Himalayas today. Maybe they were even taller. This was the home of the Central Pangean Range, formed when the Gondwana and Laurasian plates collided. This uplift reached its peak about 300 million years ago. Once the plates reversed course and Pangaea split up, these mountains began the long process of erosion into what they are today. The wind and water slowly grinding them down to their present stage. This is considered one of the most scenic places in Alabama, and there is an abundance of natural treasures to be discovered. If you are in the exploring mood, then you may wish to check out several waterfalls around the Highpoint, to include Devil's Den, Cheaha Falls, and High Falls. Humans have been living in what is now Alabama for at least 13,000 years. These Paleo-Indian tribes were originally hunting and gathering societies, following the migration patterns of game, and at the time, hunting the megafauna that still existed, like mammoths, mastodons, and ground sloths. One of the best sites in Alabama with archaeological evidence of these early people is in Bridgeport, near the Tennessee border. There you'll find Russell Cave, a location that has proved to be an archaeological treasure trove with artifacts dating back to these ancient times. By 1100 AD, this area was inhabited by the mound-building Mississippian culture that stretched across the American Midwest into the South. There's several of these sites located across Alabama, and you can also find one of them right near Cheaha Mountain. Here in the city of Oxford, in Chuckalunka Park, you'll find this mound. It's part of the Chuckalunka Creek Archaeological Complex. This particular site has been dated back to the Middle Woodland period 2,000 years ago, when it is believed to have been a site for rituals and meetings of different tribes from the south and the north. Its heyday was around 1100 AD, when it was part of the larger Mississippian culture and connected with the Etowah site in Georgia. This site continued to evolve throughout the centuries, and even as late as the 1800s was still being used as a ceremonial site by the local Abhika tribe town. That town was a remnant itself of the earlier Coosa chiefdom. By the 16th century, the dominant tribe in the region was the Coosa. They headed up a chiefdom composed of smaller chiefdoms, exerting a domain of influence that stretched from here to the northern border of current-day Tennessee. The first Europeans to lay sight on these mountains were the Spanish soldiers from Hernando De Soto's expedition that journeyed across the American Southeast in the mid-1500s. This ill-fated expedition, and later other Spanish encroachment, became a catalyst for change. European infectious diseases and Spanish slave trade decimated the people here. In response, the remaining tribes banded together in a loose alliance known as the Creek Confederacy. It's from the Muscogee that both the range and the mountain derive their names. For the former, Talladega, it comes from the Muscogee words of Talwa, meaning town, and Atiga, meaning border, basically border town. A town in this area that sat on the border between two different tribal lands. As for the mountain, Cheaha comes from the Creek word Cheaha, meaning high place. Along with the name, a local legend has taken root, referring to the mountain as the Sleeping Giant. For over the next 250 years, the Creek Confederacy was strong enough to keep the expansionist European tendencies, and later those of the newly formed United States, relatively in check. But despite this, it was always a precarious situation. European powers made inroads into the state beginning in the latter part of the 17th century, with the British trading for deerskins with the Creek. In the early 18th century, the French established Fort Toulouse to keep British interests in check. But overall, colonial efforts in the interior of Alabama weren't as focused as places on the coast, such as Mobile. The downfall of the Creek Confederacy came about in the early 19th century, brought about by a complex web of factors. Though, to make it a bit more simple, there were three major issues that spurred it on. The first was a federal policy put in place during President George Washington's administration called the Plan of Civilization. At its core, it pushed for assimilating native tribes by moving them to small farmsteads, training Creek men and women in farming, ranching, and cloth making in order to make them self-sufficient, and selling any surpluses to get them economically invested. Of course, the plan didn't take into consideration the fact that the Muscogee had been successfully feeding and clothing themselves for centuries. But that really wasn't the real purpose. The ulterior motive was, by assimilating the Muscogee, they would give up their traditional hunting grounds. And these vast tracts of land were viewed as prime real estate for white settlement. Assimilation meant that the federal and state governments would then be able to purchase the land peacefully. When the fur trade started to dry up, the Creek had already started to take a diversified approach to commodity farming, to include cotton. And more so, they were finding success in cattle and hog ranching. But in a cruel twist, that success came to be viewed as an economic threat to white settlers. The second factor was a land scandal known as the Yazoo land fraud. It was one of the first and largest land frauds in American history. To set the context, after the American Revolutions, the former colonies, now states, that had territory stretching to the Mississippi that had been granted by their earlier colonial charters, well, a majority of them ceded that territory to the federal government. And in return, the federal government took on their debts that they had accrued in the past conflict. Georgia was the exception to this. It was loath to cede their territory. There was a lot of money to be earned from this land, particularly as the demand for westward expansion had rapidly rose. Unfortunately, due to its extensive size, the state was in no position to defend it from European interests. To mitigate this problem, Georgia looked at alternative solutions, and over the next several years, they approach things like selling the land or establishing settlements or even transferring it to the federal government. But all these were for naught. By 1794, pressure was on to realize some profit from these lands. To grease the wheels, the entire Georgia legislature, with the exception of one individual, was paid off to vote in favor of legislation authorizing the sale to 4 companies formed by supporters and cronies of Georgia lawmakers. The governor, George Matthews, had been bribed as well and signed the Yazoo Act into law in January 1795. The particulars of the deal were egregious, to say the least. We're talking about the sale of 400 million acres of land for $500,000. And while that may seem like a substantial amount of money in early America, well, to put that in some modern day perspective, that's 80 acres for under $40. The public was outraged and backlash was almost immediate. In less than a year, a new administration and legislature had been put into office, and they immediately set about passing legislation and signing it into law, rescinding the sale. Unfortunately, by that time, things had already gotten way out of hand. Sales had been made to second parties, and in some cases, to innocent third parties. By 1802, Georgia reluctantly turned over the territory beyond its current borders to the federal government, who added it to the Mississippi Territory, established a few years earlier. The federal government also took on any liabilities from the earlier sale of these lands. Along with this, though, they made a promise to Georgia that the federal government would help solve the Indian problem that Georgia was facing with the Cherokee. This promise would have severe consequences for the native tribes living in the Mississippi Territory as well. The Yazoo land fraud continues to affect U.S. society even to this day for a couple reasons. The first, the case that went before the U.S. Supreme Court was one of the first times that court overturned a state law, which became a key part of the Supremacy Clause. And the second was the decision that you are obligated to the terms of the contract in which you sign, a key part of U.S. contract law. Finally, there was war, brought about by both of the other factors. The effects of the land scandal, with its flood of cheap land, brought in new white settlers encroaching on Creek territory. The plan of civilization ratcheted up internal tensions due to the rapid culture change it imposed on the tribes. The focus on agricultural endeavors on small farmsteads drove a wedge right to the heart of Creek culture. Farming was the domain of women, whereas hunting was an essential aspect of male Creek culture. Giving up hunting was viewed as the same as giving up their land. At the start of the 19th century, the Muscogee were no fools. They knew exactly what the United States government wanted, and that it was focused on nothing more than acquiring their land. Where issues arose, though, amongst the Muscogee themselves was how to survive as a people. They quickly broke into two groups, one believing that assimilation was key, and the other believing to do so would lead to their people's demise. Tensions ratcheted up between them, and it wasn't long before civil war broke out. It began with Upper Creek towns, known as Red Sticks, opposing white encroachment on their territory. Other members of the Confederacy wanted to continue with peaceful solutions. The conflict quickly spilled over into the larger, ongoing War of 1812, and the U.S. was quick to take advantage of the situation. One of the clashes in the vicinity of Cheaha Mountain was the Battle of Talladega, where American troops defeated a Red Stick war party. Remnants of Red Stick forces retreated to the slopes of the mountain after their defeat. About 45 miles south of the mountain, on March 27th, 1814, General Andrew Jackson followed up with the decisive blow here at Horseshoe Bend. The Red Sticks had fortified their village behind a 400-yard wooden barricade. If you come here and you look, you'll see a series of white posts designating where that structure would have been. The fortifications built were substantial, as Jackson himself noted. Unfortunately, the part of the village along the shore was still exposed, and Jackson was able to use his superior numbers to take advantage of this weakness. The artillery up here on Gun Hill proved ineffective against the stoutness of the barricade, but Jackson's diversion did its job, drawing attention away from the fortifications to the threat over by the village. With this in play, Jackson ordered a bayonet charge, and American soldiers breached the fortifications. Desperate hand-to-hand fighting broke out between American soldiers and Red Stick warriors. The end result was a catastrophe for the Red Sticks. 800 of the 1,000 Red Stick warriors were killed as they fought to the bitter end. Women and children were not spared either, with many killed when the village of Tohopica was assaulted. If you're going to highpoint Cheaha Mountain, it's worth coming down here to Horseshoe Bend National Military Park to visit this battlefield. You can still see the areas where the Red Sticks made their final stand. It's not an understatement to say that this battle here was a turning point. The defeat of the Red Sticks effectively ended any resistance to white settlement in the Mississippi Territory. At the signing of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, the tribes in the area ceded 23 million acres of land to the United States. Land wasn't the only thing lost. The attitude of white settlers and U.S. lawmakers had changed as well. The plan of civilization was viewed as a failure, and expulsion of the tribes became the agreed-upon solution. Alabama became its own territory in 1817, when the western half of the larger Mississippi Territory was split to form the state of Mississippi. The name Alabama actually comes from the Alabama River, which in turn comes from a native tribe that was part of the Creek Confederacy, known as the Alabamans. Alabama rapidly grew both economically and in population. In 1810, there were only about 10,000 white settlers, those early arrivals homesteading first along the banks of the rivers winding through the state, then later in the Black Belt area, a swath of land stretching east to west across the south-central part of Alabama. The rich soil of the area proved ideal for agriculture, specifically for growing cotton, and the population boomed, numbering 300,000 people just 2 decades later, with cotton firmly established as Alabama's main economic driver. In 1819, Alabama was granted statehood. Despite this, the Muscogee still held a substantial chunk of land up in the northeast part of the state. Alabama lawmakers were dead set on acquiring this territory, and to do so, they passed laws and restrictions on the Muscogee, prohibiting fishing, prohibiting hunting, prohibiting them to gather in councils, effectively stripping away any power from the tribal chiefs and the elders. Even as the Muscogee moved to assimilate, conditions were made more intolerable for them to stay here. By the early 1830s, the Creek, along with other southern tribes, were forcibly relocated to Oklahoma, on the Trail of Tears. Thousands died on the journey. Historic sites related to the removal of the tribes can be found across the northern part of the state. While settlement in Alabama continued to grow, it was slower in this area. There was a gold mining boom in the 1830s, but it didn't lead to much permanent settlement. It didn't start in earnest until after the creek had been removed. The original counties in this part of the state formed in 1832. The land here wasn't as conducive for the large-scale cotton plantations you would have found down in the Black Belt region. Instead, majority of the settlers here established smaller, self-sustaining farms. Along with this, though, came the logging industry. The timber stands in the region were in high demand for a growing state. The mountains served as a striking backdrop and witness as towns sprang up around it. The town of Oxford, at the north end of the mountain, was founded in the early 1850s. One of the surviving artifacts of this time is the Goldwater Creek Covered Bridge, the oldest covered bridge in the state. It was built by a former slave around the same time the city was founded. During the U.S. Civil War, due to the economic makeup of this region, there was stronger Union support here. Despite this, the war didn't leave this place unscathed. The Union launched several raids targeting a growing iron industry. An interesting side note, the little town of Mumford, west of the mountain, experienced a raid in the middle of 1865 that's often been referred to as the last Civil War battle in Alabama. The pace quickened with the arrival of the Alabama and Tennessee River Railway. The railway opened the area up to further industry and development in the form of ironworking, logging, and textiles. But there was a cost to all of this. For an area that today is often touted as one of the most beautiful places in the state, that hasn't always been the case. By the early 20th century, agriculture and logging had taken a devastating toll on the landscape. This area was an environmental disaster of eroded vacant farms and cut-over timberlands. It took a combination of factors to transform this area into what we find today. One of them was the passage of the 1927 State Land Act, which authorized the development and operation of state parks in Alabama. Another was the establishment of the Talladega National Forest in 1936, authorized by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Cheaha State Park was the first state park established in the Yellowhammer State, opening its doors to the public in 1933. Today, it continues to welcome visitors and is the oldest continuously operating state park in Alabama. Perhaps no organization has had as great an impact on what this place looks like nowadays than the Civilian Conservation Corps. They're the other factor in how this place came to be. In the 1930s, the United States was in the clutches of the Great Depression. Unemployment was rampant, and the South was in deep trouble. It was in this environment that the Civilian Conservation Corps was created in 1933. It became one of the most popular of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs, putting young, unemployed men to work with a focus on the conservation and development of natural resources in rural lands. The CCC established programs in states across the country, and Alabama was no exception. In the 9 years of existence in the state, there were over 30 companies on average every year. In total, the Civilian Conservation Corps employed over 66,000 Alabama men. The program left a lasting impact here, building 1,800 miles of roads, 61 lookout towers, 490 bridges, 188 buildings, and 1,430 miles of telephone lines across Alabama. CCC companies also constructed fire breaks, fought forest fires, reseeded woodlands, worked on soil erosion control projects, helped to control insect epidemics, and also inventoried forest resources. They were also responsible for the establishment and improvement of 12 state parks, including Cheaha Mountain. It was their labor that made this place, and their presence is still felt today in how it looks and operates. This was the first step in revitalizing this region into the beautiful scenery we enjoy today. 3 CCC companies worked to shape Cheaha Mountain State Park, and their efforts were wide-ranging, from reseeding the forests, building Bald Rock Lodge and the park roads, to hand-shoveling the 6-acre lake and building the dam to fill it. For those who want a more in-depth look at what the Civilian Conservation Corps accomplished here, then the mountain's CCC Museum is worth checking out. You'll find it in the most distinct man-made structure on the peak, a place we'll be checking out shortly. In addition to the high point, there are a whole slew of activities you'll find at Cheaha Mountain State Park, to include climbing and rappelling, mountain biking, fishing, and in the National Forest, you'll find even more, like panning for gold. Cheaha Mountain is a top wedding spot destination in Alabama for folks that are looking to tie the knot on the rooftop of the Yellowhammer State. If you're searching for more of a challenge or a nice hike to pair with your high-pointing excursion, then the park does offer an array of hiking trails of various lengths and skill levels. Surprisingly, though, there is no direct hiking trail to the summit itself. For those that are on a quest for something epic, well, the mountain can provide there as well. The Pinhoti National Recreation Trail passes through here, and this 337-mile-long trail will take you all the way to the Appalachian Trail in Georgia, and from there, you can head all the way to Maine. For those folks that don't have time for some of the longer trails and still want to get in some of those fantastic views, well, there is an option for you too, and it's the Bald Rock Boardwalk. It's only 1/3 of a mile long, and the best part is it's disability accessible. Let's go check it out. Getting to the top of this high point is a rather straightforward affair. You can drive all the way up. Keep in mind, though, there is an entrance fee for the park. You'll know you've reached the correct destination when you spy this landmark right here, Bunker Tower. Built in 1934 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, it was to be the park office and an observation tower. Even today, it continues to cut a striking figure on top of the mountain. The tower was built using native stone from the region, and 62 steps will take you all the way to the top. For a mountain that is rather easy to reach the top of, finding the true summit, though, can be a little tricky, because it's not right here. As you walk up the stone pathway to the tower, you'll spy this triangulation disc right here. But this isn't the end of your adventure either. You need to go just a little bit further. To the back of the building, where these boulders are. And here we are on the summit of Cheaha Mountain, the rooftop of Alabama. With an elevation of 2,407 feet, this is the 35th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Scott Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment, click those like buttons, and subscribe. And I'll see you soon.